Hi, everyone. Looks like everyone's coming in slowly, so we're going to give it about another minute before we get started. So thank you for your patience. All right, looks like we'll get started. I want to welcome everyone to part 2 of our webinar series on industrial cybersecurity. So today's topic is choosing the right network infrastructure to support your security policy. My name is Scott Siphon with Moxa. I'll be your moderator today. So hopefully many of you had a chance to come to our first webinar a couple weeks ago, where we really just talked about, where do you get started on the cybersecurity journey? We talked about some tips like, just making sure you have a security policy in place, making sure you take an inventory of those of devices on your network, and then also who has access to those devices. So if you haven't had a chance to view that, please make sure to check out our YouTube channel or just reach out to us and we'll send you a link to the recording. For today's webinar, though, we're going to bring back two of our resident experts on cybersecurity, Rich Wood and Marty Wachi. So they're going to continue to share their knowledge on cybersecurity and how Mox has taken a holistic approach to OT cybersecurity. So before we get started, just one housekeeping item. As always, we want to hear from you guys. We want to get your questions. Please send those in through the Q&A box at the very bottom. Send those to me, and we'll address those with Marty and Rich at the very end. So without further ado, Marty, you want to take things over?
Hey, thanks, Scott. Thanks. Hi, everybody. So let's just really quickly recap what we went over in the first go around. Is going to be kind of the intro, talk a little bit about some of the industry trends. Want to spend some time really talking about why your infrastructure choices and capabilities should be guided by your security policy to kind of make sure you're getting the right features in the products that you're selecting, both now and in the future. Rich will share some practical first steps, and then we'll start to kind of summarize kind of what we covered here with an introduction to how it fits into vertical security and how we can frame that and contrast it with horizontal security, which will be a primary focus of the last session, and then we'll kind of do some Q&A. So just a recap of kind of the previous webinar. This is obviously a very long, never-ending journey as we try and up the ante against the different attackers that are kind of coming against our OT networks. We really emphasized how planning is essential in that process and why a security policy is so important. And if you don't have one, how to leverage industry resources like 62443. And then just to remind everybody, Moxa and our partners are here to support you on this journey, so you don't have to feel like you're trying to do this on your own. So definitely reach out to us or our partners if you have any questions or need any help. So just to kind of lay out the journey again, we started the last one with where do you start establishing a security policy, really doing the planning and inventory of your networks. I believe this is probably where most of you are today, in some state of deploying some type of vertical security, implementing your security policy, or trying to follow some standard like 62443. So we're going to drill down a little bit more into some of the details around authorization and access control, and implementing those things from a vertical security perspective. And then our next webinar and our final one will really introduce the horizontal security concept, really looking at proactive monitoring and response, and looking at technologies like intrusion detection and prevention, and threat analysis to really augment that vertical security, to really try and stay ahead of what's happening with the attackers and the kinds of attacks that they're doing now. So just again, to look at kind of the threats by vector, we've taken kind of a people, process, and technology view to kind of align to this. We're going to focus today specifically on the technology piece, where if you can see here, the biggest section of threats is really that weak authentication. So this is an area that we're going to focus on today, both in my section, and which has some good things to do in terms of where to start there as well. So why infrastructure choices and capabilities should be guided by your security policy is really about making sure that really the things that you're purchasing from a network infrastructure perspective meet your needs, both today and in the future. And keep it in mind that IT networks and IT security policies may not necessarily always translate to OT networking and security policy choices directly, because we're looking at different priorities here in terms of business priorities, focus, what we're trying to protect, and some of the environmental conditions, OT being very different, as I think most of you already know. So if we look at kind of this at overall, we discussed how the security policy is really a blueprint or plan of how all these things come together, of the who, what, and where. So if we kind of drill down a little bit further today, we're going to kind of focus on two pieces: authentication and segmentation. Authentication about, are you who you say you are? Based on your identity, what should you have access to from a network perspective? And then on the segmentation side, or the vertical security piece, establishing those perimeters or gates within your network to create defensive perimeters, to keep things out. And if something does, bypass that, to somehow keep it contained from spreading to your entire network. And then using things like access controls and things like that to restrict users and applications from being able to just kind of go all over your network. So if we focus on authentication, there's kind of two pieces of it that I kind of want to focus on. So the first one is really keeping in mind that this is really the most common network security exploit. You saw kind of in the previous data, this is where 43% of those attacks are, happened. So there's two types of authentication. There's the device authentication, which is management, and is that encrypted or not encrypted? There's the user and network authentication or access, in terms of how do you get onto the network. Rich is going to have some examples here of, again, some other simpler things that you can do if you don't want to, if you're not ready to go to all the way to kind of some of these best practices. But things like password strength and, again, encryption for management traffic are things that definitely, if you don't already have implemented, you should be thinking about. And then, a lot of companies are starting to look at, dual factor and multi-authentication as well. To kind of go hand in hand with the authentication is really, the centralized authentication for LAN, VPN, and Wi-Fi access. This is a little bit more complicated and not so straightforward sometimes, but does have a lot of benefits. It does require a radius or AAA or some other type of centralized authentication server, but it does enable you single sign-on, which means your username and password can be the same for authenticating to the network, the VPNs, the wireless, and it makes it also easier for adds, moves, and changes. So if when you have an employee leave, you can make sure that all their credentials are revoked at the same time, and you don't have to go machine to machine or device to device and make sure that it's been cleared out or updated. Just one other point, sometimes this is kind of more of in the myth category. Sometimes it's not well understood, especially from, on the OT side. The IT folks will be talking about, enterprise authentication and policy servers like Cisco ICE or HP ClearPaths. Both of them do support AAA and radius authentication, which is kind of what we're focusing on here today. So they can interoperate with those devices, even though they may not be from Cisco or HP. So I think that's worth mentioning as well. On the encryption and segmentation piece, encryption is really about, determining what level of encryption we need depending on what we're trying to protect. And some of that is determined based on how long is the data relevant. So if you're trying to protect like a social security number or something like that, that never really expires or has a infinite usefulness date, you'll probably want to use a stronger encryption than something like a stock trading tip that it may take a few days or weeks to break with lower encryption, but by the time it's broken, the data is really no longer relevant. And this encryption really applies to both VPNs and wireless networks, remote access and wireless. When you look at some of the newer encryption like triple DES or AES 128 or 256, they're very difficult to break via a brute force type of attack, trying to break the actual encryption. It's more likely that it's going to be compromised via weak authentication, kind of going back to the last slide that we just showed and kind of the importance. The second piece is really the segmentation, establishing these gates. So this is where your networking devices, you create defense perimeters using technologies like VLANs, firewalls, NAT, to kind of keep people out, establishing kind of a outer perimeter. But at the same time, you can also use it to create kind of some smaller inner perimeter groups to try and kind of contain the spread of bad activity or limiting access. And you can further restrict access by, access control list, firewall and NAT rules. So here's a chart to kind of just summarize some of the business requirements that you may be looking at in terms of single sign-on or authentication and things like that. And then the next column really goes into the technical features of some of the products that you may be selecting to match kind of those security policies. The two things I'd like to kind of point out as you look at the relevant technologies between managed switching, routing, and wireless is a couple observations. So the first one, going back to strong authentication policy, if you look at the first kind of 3.5, 4 rows, they kind of span across all the technologies. So these things would be very relevant to establishing a strong authentication policy and addressing that weak authentication. The last thing I'd point out is in the context of routing, a way to bolster your vertical security, which is something I think all of us are looking to do. You could introduce routing to the equation. And here you can see that you're adding some additional security features like hiding IP addresses, creating logical segmentation, VPN things. This is something that's not common in an IT network. So this is where it's more specific to OT networks, where we would deploy routers within your OT network. It'd be fairly uncommon in an enterprise IT network for us to see, a similar type of segmentation utilizing this technology. So again, just to summarize a couple things in terms of the features, business requirements, and again, the importance of the strong authentication. So with that, Scott, maybe we can bring up the first poll question. So the first question here is that we'd like to get some of your input on is we use a centralized authentication system for single sign-on, such as Radius, AAA, TACAX. Do you have that? Yes, no, I don't know. So if you guys could take a second and fill that out. The second question is, are we using routers to segment our local area networks into isolated cells and segments? So again, if you are doing this, we'd like to know, or if you've got, you don't know that you're doing that, or maybe you don't know at all. And the last question is, do you have a mix of wireless and wired network devices in your OT network? So if you could answer those questions, we'll just give you another couple seconds here, and then Scott, how's it looking? Does it look like we got a lot of the votes in here?
Yeah, looks good, Marty. I'm going to end the poll right now.
All right, thank you. All right, so it looks like a good number of you are using some centralized authentication, so that's awesome. It looks like a bunch of you either don't know or aren't, so opportunity for improvement there, but Rich will talk about some things that you can do even if you're not in his section. Really good to see that you guys are using routers to segment your network, a good number of you. And almost the same number do have a mix of wireless and wired networks. So thanks for sharing that. Looks like that's some good information. So let's keep going here. And let me introduce Rich Wood to kind of go through some practical first steps here. Rich.
Thanks, Marty. So a lot of the things that that Marty's brought up, we're going to go into some kind of practical implementations of some of those technologies. And there's three things that I just want to run through. First is know what's on your network. It's hard to protect what you don't understand. So getting a good handle on what's on your network is a great first step. Then deploying basic device security. So it's pretty common to find as if you were to try to implement one of those best practices type security policies, you'd very likely find that many of the devices on your network are not capable of being configured to those policies. So starting with configuring what you can is a great place to start. And then third, segmenting your network. So breaking it down into smaller chunks so that if someone were to get into your network, they don't have access to the whole network. So going into know what's on your network. So it's pretty common for us to see that industrial control system networks have been pieced together over years or even decades with improvements or add-ons or upgrades, and that people don't really have or haven't kept up with, what does the total network look like? And so you really need to know what you're trying to protect. And so we typically ask people, do you have a current inventory of what devices are on your network? How are they connected? Do you know what the topology of your network looks like? And third, would you know if someone connected an unapproved device to your network? It's pretty common to see when we go out there and do some of these audits on factory networks that there are wireless access points that have been put in place so that people can more easily access the network. They were put in for legitimate business reasons, but maybe not with the proper security put behind it. And this can be a vulnerability for your network. So with that, Scott, can you launch the second round of poll questions there? So what statement best describes your knowledge of your ICS network? First, I have no idea what's on my network or what it looks like. Second, I have a network inventory and network diagram, but I'm not sure it's up to date. 3, I have an accurate inventory and network diagram of what should be on the network, but wouldn't know if somebody added to it. Or 4, I have real-time data on my network inventory and topology and would be alerted to new devices being added. So why don't you take a minute there and just check what best describes your current situation, and then we'll take a look at the results.
All right, Rich, looks like we'll end the polling. I'll share the results.
All right. Okay, so it looks like about a third of you don't know what your network looks like, and that's a lot more common than we would expect. I have a network diagram, but I'm not sure it's up to date. Again, very common. So more than 50% of respondents right now aren't really sure what's on their network. I have an accurate inventory network diagram, but wouldn't know if somebody added to it, about a third of you. And it looks like 10% have real-time data on their network and are using alerts. So that's pretty representative of what we see out there. So one of the things that we like to recommend that people use is a network management software. So typically, you can find open source versions of network management software. You can find some good industrial specific versions for about the price of a managed switch. Certainly there's more expensive, more complicated versions out there as well. But generally we're looking for some of these features in a network management software package. The first is asset management. So most of these programs, when you run them, they'll do an auto discovery that goes out and looks on the network and finds all of the devices that are on your network. Second, they can then automatically draw the topology of the network so that you have a good sense of how they're put together and what the network actually looks like. They also have a lot of configuration management capabilities. So as you've got, dozens or even, hundreds of devices on your network, being able to back up and restore the configuration of the devices in the event that something's compromised. And then security event detection and logging is really critical. So this is the part where you really want to know if somebody's gone in and changed a configuration file on a device, or if there's a firewall rule that's being breached, that's being hit on a regular basis, or even if somebody adds a new device to the network. You can set these up with alerts that will allow you to know in real time if these things are happening so that you can do something about it. So second, we talk about device security or hardening devices. And so these are a lot of the things that Marty was talking about. So user authentication. So are you who you say you are, and should you have access to the network? Encryption. So your management interfaces, as people are getting in and doing these configurations, you want to make sure that those are done securely and that those connections are encrypted. So disabling the unencrypted ports and access vastly increases your security. Then network access control and authentication. So which devices on the network are permitted to access the network and communicate to other devices? And finally, vulnerability management. So making sure that the firmware on your devices is up to date with the latest security patches, and that you have a way to find out if there is a firmware update available, or there is a patch available for a vulnerability on those devices. So we start with passwords. I mean, and we've all had experience with this. If you go to your bank, they're not going to let you choose password as your password or ABC123. So being able to set policies that enable more stronger passwords. And so this basically protects against brute force attacks. If you've got a simple password, there's software out there that can crack those passwords in a matter of hours. So simply making a longer, more complex password makes it that much harder for somebody to use brute force. And second, things like, if you go to your bank and you plug in the wrong password 2 or 3 times, they're probably going to lock you out for some period of time. Again, that slows down the brute force attacks. So that can take a brute force attack that might be successful in hours to years. And so this definitely helps protect you, even though it's a simple thing. The second is encryption. So we talked about network management software. They typically use SNMP, or Simple Network Management Protocol, in order to share information about what's on the network and what's going on the network. You want to make sure you're using the encrypted version of that, which is version 3, because somebody that has access to the network can, snip that data and find out a lot about your network if that communication path is not encrypted. Second, when you're logging into your devices, making sure that your sessions are using secure encrypted connections using either HTTPS, SSL, or SSH. Again, it just keeps your passwords and usernames from being sent over the network in plain text. So Marty talked a lot about centralized authentication, and we want to just kind of back off a little bit and say there's some simpler options out there. So simply starting with static port locks. So if you want to make sure that the devices connected to your network are the devices that should be, using static port locks can allow you to, plug a device into a switch and basically say that, hey, this MAC address is what's supposed to be on this port. Don't accept traffic from anything else. Sticky MAC is another way to do the same thing, but a little bit more automated. So as your network grows, rather than having to manually go into each port on each device and plug in a MAC address, this has basically like a learning function. So when you plug in all the devices to the network when you're first starting out, it'll record the MAC addresses for the devices that are on each port, and then basically say anything new that comes into this port is not going to be allowed. And so that just keeps people from being able to unplug a device from a port, plug a laptop in, and then have access to your network. So then getting into the more complex IEEE 802.1x. So that's where you get into needing a server, some sort of authentication server. This is generally considered a best practice, but there are other options out there if you don't have that capability right off the bat. And finally, security advisories. So can't emphasize enough that making sure that the firmware is up to date on the devices on your network. Almost every manufacturer has had some sort of vulnerability out there over the past few years. And most reputable vendors will produce patches for those and make those available through firmware updates. So making sure that you have the latest firmware is the best way that you can protect against known vulnerabilities. And most reputable manufacturers will have that information on their website. Many of them will have ways to subscribe to updates so that you can know in real time as these types of things are posted to the websites. So we just went through, some of the components of what we would consider a basic or general baseline for security. And even though these things are fairly simple, they do have a tremendous impact on the security of your network, especially since a lot of the breaches that have been reported are, using fairly simple means. So if you've got devices out there that have the default username or password from the manufacturer, changing a password to something different dramatically, it's like locking your front door. So the other thing I wanted to point out on this is that as we get into more advanced security policies, like the ones defined in IEC 62443, level 1 and level 2, you're starting from the same baseline. You're just adding more security features as you go up the levels there. So the last thing I want to talk about is defense in depth, or segmenting your network. So the idea that you put a firewall on the perimeter of the factory and call it a day is generally not great for an industrial control network. In many cases, you want to break up the network and segment it for two reasons. One, if somebody were to get in, that it limits the access to just the segment they broke into rather than the entire network. Second, you're reducing your broadcast domain, which is going to make your network more stable and minimize the impact of a network problem in one area from affecting your entire factory. It also makes it easier to troubleshoot should you have a problem like that. Second, we talk about data filtering, or the use of firewalls. So if you've got a zone, say a manufacturing cell that is producing parts, and you're feeding production data up to your SCADA or your manufacturing system. For example, let's say that's speaking Ethernet IP. If that's the type of data that's supposed to be being communicated between you and your SCADA system, then you can limit it to that type of traffic so that other types of traffic can't get through. And again, this is just giving it only the access that's required. And the third one, which is a biggie that we see out there, is secure remote access. So more often than not, if we find a device on a network that's not supposed to be there, it's to provide some sort of remote access to the network. And so making sure that what secure remote access paths are available, and making sure that they're encrypted and secure, and that you can control them, is very important. So overall, that's a wrap up of what I have to talk about today on that. I'll turn things back over to Marty, and you can finish things up with a little discussion on vertical versus horizontal security.
Hey, thanks, Rich. Okay, so Rich spent some time talking about kind of defense in depth, and we talked a lot about routers and ACLs and authentication, and a lot of that really falls under this category of vertical security, which is really the foundation for all OT security. It's really establishing those defense perimeters, those containment zones, those ways to kind of limit access, like Rich was just talking about, protect that user data, which is all great. This is kind of, again, the fundamental start. At some point, though, those defenses are going to be breached, and then at what point that happens, then what do you do? And this is where horizontal security comes in, and this is really what we'll spend the majority of the last session coming up in a couple weeks on, is really talking about that threat visibility and threat response that really complements that vertical security that many of you have probably already implemented. And here we'll be talking a little bit about intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system, and virtual patching to protect some of your critical assets. So with that, just a shameless plug for our industrial cybersecurity site. This is where the recordings of this and other webinars are. It has some more information about the ARC model that we've been going through from a cybersecurity perspective. It's really just kind of a one-stop resource for all of our security assets. There's white papers and a bunch of other things there. So I'd encourage you to go check it out. So just kind of wrapping up, again, this is really this never-ending journey that we're trying to help our customers through, depending on where your starting point is. Today, hopefully, we kind of made the point about how important strong authentication policies and access control to your network is to kind of make sure that that biggest exploit of the network, weak authentication, is kind of addressed. Introduce kind of the concept of vertical security, establishing those defense perimeters and containment zones within your network. And then just as a reminder that, again, you're not alone on this journey. Moxa and our partners are here to support you. So, if you have any questions, definitely reach out to us. So with that, let's open up the question and answer, Scott.
Yeah, no, thanks, Marty. Thank you, Rich. So we have a few questions. Hopefully we can get through all of these. So the first one I have is, I see the benefits of having centralized authentication. What are the requirements for me to deploy this? Marty, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple pieces to it. The first piece is you do have to have some type of authentication server, which is going to be a AAA, Radius, TACX. You can leverage, if your IT guys are using Cisco ICE or HP ClearPass. The second piece is that your network devices have to support authentication to that server or service. So even if you're not using it today, you may want to, if you think you're going to go down that path, you feel like you want to have single sign-on capabilities like we talked about, even if you may not be ready to implement it, you may want to go ahead and make sure the devices that you're purchasing have the ability to authenticate out to like a AAA server. And you saw, there's a good number of you that are already doing that.
Great. Thanks, Marty. So this next question came in from Dan. What's the significance of using a router to segment local networks?
Rich, you want to take that one? Or you
Yeah,
want me to answer?
I'll take that one. Yeah, so basically using a router to segment the local network accomplishes a couple of things. First, it contains any bad traffic to the specific zone that is within the confines of the router access. And second, it reduces your broadcast domain. So that means if you have, say, like a broadcast storm, that would keep that traffic within the subnet that is defined by that router, and keep it from propagating throughout your entire network.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Rich. We have another one. Rich, this might be best for you. Says we're looking to implement MAC address-based authentication, but our facilities are air-gapped. Considering the costs associated with hosting an 802.1x server at each facility, would you recommend MAC address sticky on managed switches as an alternative?
That certainly is an alternative. I mean, that's typically one of the main reasons that we do see sticky MAC used is, people aren't ready to uh, invest the cost and the complexity of putting in a server and implementing 802.1x, or they have a lot of components that don't support 802.1x, and so they would also just try to use the sticky MAC to provide that MAC address based authentication without the need for a server. So yeah, that's a good alternative.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Looks like we have time for one more. So the last one is, you mentioned network management software could alert me of security events. So how would I receive these alerts?
I'll answer that one. So typically the network management software is going to be logging these types of events, and many of them have the option to set up alerts through email, through text message. Some of them can even do it through various social media platforms, and many of them also have APIs to allow you to connect to other systems within the network, such as your SCADA. Or an IT security software package that IT might be using to monitor security. So there's a variety of different ways, from simple to complex. The one that we sell also has a mobile app that gives you similar access to the network as the on-premise solution, and would give you alerts right on that app. As well as giving you access to see what's actually going on from the app.
Okay, thank you for that, Rich. We're going to close the webinar at this point. Marty, Rich, thanks for your time today. For everyone out there, thanks for joining. Thanks for your time today. If you have any questions, reach out to anyone of us on this call, or to your regional sales manager. If not, we'll see you in a couple weeks. 2 weeks from this Thursday, we have the last installment of our webinar series called Taking a Horizontal Approach to Cybersecurity. So we will talk to you then. Have a good one. Bye.